The dinner party was silent, except for the sound of a father chewing because the emperor had just ordered him to eat the meal placed before him. The father's hands were shaking as he lifted the fork because the meat on his plate was not beef or pork, but something far more personal and horrifying. Hours earlier, he had watched his own son be executed for a minor mistake, and now Caligula was forcing him to dine with a smile on his face to prove his loyalty. If the father shed a single tear or stopped eating for even a second, the guards standing behind him would slaughter the rest of his family before dessert was served. This is not a scene from a horror movie, but a documented moment from the reign of Emperor Caligula, the man who turned Rome into his personal asylum. History remembers him as mad, but madness implies a lack of control, and Caligula knew exactly what he was doing when he terrified the most powerful empire on earth. You have heard the rumors about the horse he made a senator, but that was a joke compared to the 8 forbidden acts that froze the blood of his own court. Stop what you are doing and listen closely, because we are about to open the doors to the imperial palace where the only rule was that Caligula's nightmare was everyone else's reality. The marble floors of the palace were polished to a mirror shine, but the reflections they caught were often twisted faces of terror that no historian dared to record fully. We are going to walk through the corridors of power where a 24-year-old boy with the power of a god decided to test the limits of human cruelty. The first act that shattered the sanity of the court was known as the Ritual of the Living God, where Caligula decided that being an emperor was simply too small a title. He began to appear in the Senate, dressed not in togas, but in the costumes of various deities wearing the golden beard of Jupiter or the trident of Neptune. The terror wasn't in the costume, but in the requirement that the senators worship him as the physical incarnation of that god right there on the Senate floor. Imagine the most powerful men in Rome, elderly statesmen with decades of service, forced to prostrate themselves and pray to a young man wearing a dress and a fake beard. If anyone hesitated or showed a flicker of amusement, they were dragged out and executed for blasphemy because rejecting Caligula was now rejecting the divine itself. He would hold conversations with the statue of Jupiter in the temple, whispering into its stone ear, and then shouting at it for arguing back with him. The court had to pretend they heard the statue speaking to nodding along to a one-sided argument between a madman and a block of marble. It created a collective delusion where reality was suspended and the only truth was whatever hallucination the emperor was having at that exact moment. But the religious mockery was just the beginning, because Caligula's second forbidden act involved the complete perversion of the Roman legal system. He introduced the silent trials, where he would summon wealthy nobles to his private chambers in the middle of the night without any warning or charges. They would be forced to stand before him while he lay on his couch, sipping wine and staring at them without saying a single word for hours. The psychological pressure of the silence was unbearable, as the accused men would begin to sweat and tremble, wondering what crime they had committed in their sleep. Eventually, the men would break down and start confessing to imaginary crimes or offering their entire fortunes to the emperor just to end the torture of the stare. Caligula would then smile and dismiss them or have them killed based on a whim, deciding their fate with the casual indifference of a child crushing an insect. These trials had no records and no witnesses, only the terrifying rumor that if you were summoned at night, you might never see the sun again. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare, ensuring that every rich man in Rome lived in constant fear of a knock at the door. The third forbidden act was his obsession with the sea's submission. which culminated in one of the most bizarre and wasteful military orders in history. He marched the most disciplined army in the world, the Roman legions, all the way to the shores of Gaul, facing the English Channel as if prepared for invasion. But instead of ordering them to board ships, he ordered the soldiers to draw their swords and attack the ocean itself to punish Neptune for a perceived slight. Thousands of battle-hardened soldiers were forced to stab the water and collect seashells in their helmets as spoils of war to be displayed in a triumph. The commanders watched in horror as the dignity of the Roman military was shredded by a command that turned their legendary discipline into a farce. But they obeyed because they knew that Caligula's fourth act was the logic of the Thais beast, where he fed humans to the wild animals in the arena, not for crimes, but for inventory management. When the price of beef rose too high to feed the lions and tigers kept for the games, Caligula ordered the prisons to be emptied to provide meat. He didn't care about the sentences of the prisoners. He simply walked down the line of inmates pointing and saying, from bald head to bald head, ordering everyone in between to the beasts. The court watched from the imperial box as innocent men awaiting trial for minor debts were torn apart by starving predators alongside hardened murderers. The emperor laughed and ate fruit while the sand turned red, treating the massacre as a prudent fiscal decision to save money on animal feed. This absolute disregard for human life extended to his own family, which brings us to the fifth forbidden act, the sisters. Divinity. Caligula had an unnatural and obsessive love for his sister Drusilla, which shocked the conservative Roman society to its core. When she died, he didn't just mourn her. He declared her a goddess and imposed a period of mandatory public mourning that paralyzed the empire. It became a capital crime to laugh, to bathe, or to dine with one's family during this period, because any sign of happiness was an insult to the new deity. He executed a man for selling hot water because comfort was forbidden in a world where Drusilla was dead. The court lived in a gray world of performative grief, terrified that a smile or a joke would lead to their execution for sacrilege. He even commanded that a statue of Drusilla be placed in the Senate house so that she could oversee the proceedings from beyond the grave. This emotional tyranny meant that the emperor's mood dictated the emotional state of millions of people who had to weep when he wept. But the sixth act was perhaps the most humiliating for the elite, the palace brothel, where he turned the wives of high-ranking senators into prostitutes. To raise funds for his lavish lifestyle, Caligula opened a brothel inside the imperial palace and staffed it with the noble women of Rome. He forced senators to bring their wives and then auction them off to the public, while the husbands were forced to watch and even bid on other women. It was a calculated destruction of the social order, stripping the aristocracy of their dignity and reducing them to pimps and commodities. The shame was absolute. Men who ruled provinces and commanded armies were reduced to weeping in the corridors while their wives were used to fill the treasury. Caligula would then publicly review the sexual performance of these women at dinner parties in front of their husbands, adding vocal critique to the injury. It ensured that no senator could ever look him in the eye again with pride because he had seen them at their absolute lowest point. He destroyed the family unit of his rivals, ensuring they were too broken by shame to ever organize a conspiracy against him. The seventh forbidden act was the Bridge of Ships, a project born out of a prophecy that said he had no more chance of becoming emperor than of riding a horse across the Bay of Baia. To prove the soothsayer wrong, Caligula ordered thousands of merchant ships to be seized and anchored side by side across the 3-mile stretch of the bay. This act crippled the Roman food supply, as the ships used for importing grain were now acting as a floating pontoon for the emperor's vanity project. He covered the ships with earth and built a road upon them, riding his horse back and forth for 2 days, wearing the breastplate of Alexander the Great. While he rode in triumph, Rome began to starve because the grain shipments from Egypt were stuck in the ports with no ships to carry them. The court had to applaud this miracle while knowing that the people in the streets were rioting for bread due to the emperor's stunt. He invited hostages and friends onto the bridge and then, in a fit of drunken mania, threw many of them into the sea to drown. He watched them struggle in the water, pushing them back under with oars, claiming they were sacrifices to the sea god he had conquered. It was a display of omnipotence that cost the empire millions of coins and countless lives just to settle a petty bet with a fortune-teller. And finally, the 8th forbidden act, the one that likely sealed his fate, was his declaration of the move to Alexandria. They saw the lists of names he kept in 2 notebooks titled The Dagger and The Sword, which contained the names of everyone he intended to kill before his departure. The fear in the palace shifted from the fear of pain to the fear of extinction as they realized no one would be left alive to turn out the lights. These 8 acts created an atmosphere of paranoia so thick that the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own protectors, began to plot his death not for power but for survival. They realized that a man who could order a father to eat his son's execution dinner was capable of anything. The assassination, when it finally came, was brutal and chaotic, carried out in a tunnel beneath the palace by men who were terrified of what he might do next. They stabbed him 30 times, not just to kill him, but to make sure that the monster was truly dead and couldn't rise again. Caligula died at the age of 28, having ruled for less than 4 years, but in that time he scarred the psyche of Rome forever. His reign showed the world what happens when absolute power is given to a broken mind that recognizes no boundaries. The dinner parties stopped being silent the moment he died, but the ghosts of those who were forced to smile remained in the palace halls. Historians tried to erase his memory, destroying his statues and melting his coins, but the stories of his cruelty survived because fear is a powerful storyteller. When you walk through the ruins of the Palatine Hill today, you can almost hear the whispers of the courtiers terrified to speak. You can imagine the father lifting his fork trying to swallow the meat that was his son while the emperor watched with dead eyes. Caligula wasn't just a bad emperor. He was a living nightmare that Rome couldn't wake up from until they washed the floors with his blood. He proved that the most dangerous thing in the world is not a foreign army, but a leader who has lost his connection to humanity. The Forbidden Acts were not just laws broken. They were the breaking of the human spirit in the most public way possible. He turned the whole world into a stage for his madness and forced everyone to play a part in his tragedy. So when you read about the Roman emperors, remember that Caligula stands alone not for his conquests, but for his creativity and cruelty. He didn't just kill people. He made them wish they were dead long before the blade ever touched their skin. The terror of his court was that the rules changed every minute, and the only constant was the inevitability of suffering. He was the storm that struck Rome from the inside, destroying the pillars of society just to see them fall. And in the end he died as he lived violently and surrounded by people who hated him but feared him too much to speak until the knives were out. The legacy of Caligula is a warning that civilization is fragile and can be unmade by the whims of a single tyrant. The silence of the father at the dinner table echoes through history as the ultimate symbol of helplessness against power. It reminds us that there are fates worse than death, and Caligula was the architect of all of them. The palace is a ruin now, but the horror of what happened there is still fresh in the ink of the ancient texts. We remember him not to glorify him, but to remind ourselves of the darkness that lies in the heart of unchecked authority. The forbidden acts are no longer forbidden because the emperor is dead, but the fear they caused is immortal. It lives on in every story of tyranny and every whisper of rebellion against a mad king. Caligula may be gone, but the shadow he cast over Rome is long and cold, and it still touches us today. And somewhere in the dark corners of history, the father is still chewing, and the emperor is still smiling.